when Eleanor of Ashford climbed to the top of Beacon Hill on a clear October morning in 1351 and looked across the landscape of the Sussex Weald that had been her family's domain for 7 generations. She counted 13 villages that had been thriving farming communities 3 years earlier and were now abandoned, their fields reverting to scrub and bramble, their buildings slowly collapsing. The carefully managed agricultural landscape that had supported thousands of people, beginning its transformation back into the wild wood that had covered this land before humans had cleared it centuries ago. Before we continue, if you'd like to join me for more stories like this, feel free to subscribe. I share a new one every day, and if you don't mind, leave a comment and tell me where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. I love seeing how far these stories travel. Eleanor was 43 years old, the widow of Sir Robert of Ashford, who had died of the plague in the autumn of 1348, along with their eldest son and 2 of their 3 daughters. She had survived along with her youngest daughter, Margaret, and they now managed, if that was the right word, the family's estates that had been significantly depopulated by the plague and which Eleanor was discovering were almost impossible to maintain with the drastically reduced labor force that remained. The Ashford estates had been substantial before the plague, approximately 3,000 acres of mixed farmland, woodland, and pasture, supporting 6 villages with a total population of perhaps 800 people who worked the land as tenants, owing various obligations of rent and labor service to the Ashford family. The estates had been profitable, producing grain and wool and timber that were sold at regional markets, generating income that had supported the Ashford family's comfortable lifestyle for generations. But the plague had killed approximately half the population on the estates, had left fields untended and buildings unmaintained, had destroyed the careful balance between available labor and land, under cultivation that had made the traditional manorial system functional. Eleanor had spent the 2 years since her husband's death trying to adapt to the new reality, trying to keep the estates productive, trying to prevent complete collapse of the agricultural system that had sustained the region for centuries. But standing on Beacon Hill and looking at the abandoned villages, at the fields that were no longer fields but were becoming something else, Eleanor felt the weight of what was being lost, what was changing, what was slipping away despite her best efforts to maintain it. The view from Beacon Hill had been familiar to Eleanor for her entire adult life. She'd come here often with Robert in the early years of their marriage, standing on this same spot and looking at the landscape they managed, discussing plans for improvement and expansion, feeling the satisfaction of overseeing a productive and well-ordered domain. The view had shown a landscape intensively managed by human labor fields and neat strips showing different stages of the crop rotation, meadows carefully maintained for hay, hedgerows and woodlots managed for specific purposes, villages with their houses and barns clustered around churches and manor houses. It had been a working landscape, a cultural landscape, a place where every tree and hedge and field boundary reflected human decisions and human labor accumulated over generations. The wild wood that had once covered this region had been cleared centuries ago, transformed into a carefully organized agricultural system that fed and supported a substantial population while also producing surplus for markets. Now, looking at that same landscape in 1351, Eleanor saw the beginning of a different transformation from cultivated land back toward something wilder, less controlled, less human. The abandoned villages were most visible clusters of buildings that were already showing the effects of neglect. Roofs sagging, walls beginning to collapse, courtyards overgrown with weeds. But even more striking were the fields, the arable land that had been plowed and planted every year, but which had now gone 3 years without cultivation, and which was being colonized by opportunistic plants, by brambles and thistles, and the saplings of trees that would eventually, if left unchecked, transform these open fields back into woodland. Eleanor had brought her daughter Margaret with her to Beacon Hill, wanting to show her what was happening, wanting Margaret to understand the scale of the changes they were witnessing. Margaret was 16, old enough to comprehend what she was seeing, but young enough that she had no memory of how things had been before the plague, no baseline against which to measure the transformation. "How long before it's all forest again?" Margaret asked, looking at the landscape with the practical directness that characterized her approach to most things. Eleanor considered the question carefully. Decades, probably, maybe a century. The succession from open field to mature woodland is slow. First the annual plants, the weeds and grasses that we see colonizing the fields now. Then brambles and shrubs that can tolerate open conditions. Then pioneer tree species like birch and willow that grow quickly but don't live long. Then longer-lived trees like oak and ash and beech that will eventually dominate if the succession continues unchecked. But won't someone use the land? Won't new farmers come, or won't the survivors expand their cultivation? Perhaps, Eleanor said. Some of the abandoned land will certainly be reoccupied. But look at how much there is, Margaret. 13 villages abandoned in just the area we can see from this hill. Thousands of acres that were under cultivation 3 years ago. We don't have the labor to farm all of it, not even close. The survivors are consolidating, working the best land, letting the marginal fields go. And even if population eventually recovers, it may take generations, and in the meantime the forest will return. They stood in silence for a while, contemplating the landscape and its future. Eleanor thought about all the labor that had gone into creating the agricultural landscape she'd known generations of people, clearing trees, moving stones, plowing fields, building and maintaining hedges and ditches, and all the infrastructure that intensive agriculture required. All of that accumulated labor was being undone, was being erased by nature reclaiming what humans had temporarily taken from it. There was something both sad and strangely appropriate about this, Eleanor thought. The plague had been a natural force, a biological catastrophe that human efforts couldn't prevent or control, and now another natural force ecological succession. The forest reasserting itself was responding to the plague's effects, was filling the spaces that human death had emptied, was demonstrating that nature's processes continued regardless of human intentions or desires. Eleanor had been managing the Ashford estates for 2 years now, and she'd learned painful lessons about what was and wasn't possible with the drastically reduced labor force. In the immediate aftermath of the plague, she'd tried to maintain cultivation of all the land that had been farmed before, hoping that the crisis was temporary, that population would quickly recover, that things would return to something like normal. But this had proven impossible. The surviving tenants simply couldn't work all the land that had been cultivated before, not even with longer hours and more intensive effort. Fields had gone unplowed, crops had been left unharvested. Essential maintenance had been deferred because there literally weren't enough hands to do all the work that needed doing. Eleanor had been forced to make difficult decisions about priorities. Which fields were most productive and should be maintained? Which buildings were essential and which could be allowed to decay? Which tenants should be retained with favorable terms and which could be allowed to leave for opportunities elsewhere? How much rent should be demanded when collecting traditional amounts would drive away the remaining workers? She decided to concentrate cultivation on the best land, the valley bottoms with rich soil and reliable water, the south-facing slopes that produced good grain, the meadows that could be maintained with relatively little labor, the marginal land, the heavy clay fields that required intensive work for modest yields, the steep slopes that had always been prone to erosion, the distant fields that required long walks from the villages. These she had allowed to go out of cultivation, accepting that they would revert to waste. This consolidation had been practical and necessary, but it also meant abandoning land that her husband's family had brought under cultivation over generations, land that represented enormous investments of labor and resources, land that had been productive and valuable when there were enough workers to manage it properly. Each field that Eleanor allowed to go out of cultivation felt like a small defeat, a retreat, an acknowledgment that the world the Ashford family had known was finished. The abandoned villages posed different problems. 3 of the 6 villages on the Ashford estates had been completely depopulated. Every resident had either died or left. The buildings stood empty. The fields around them were reverting to waste. Eleanor had to decide what to do with these settlements. Should she try to attract new tenants, offering favorable terms to anyone willing to reoccupy the buildings and cultivate the fields? Should she consolidate the surviving population, moving people from the partially abandoned villages to create fewer but more viable settlements? Or should she simply accept the abandonment, salvage what materials could be reused, and let the buildings decay naturally? She'd chosen different approaches for different villages. One that was well located near good farmland she'd tried to maintain, offering extremely favorable tenancy terms to anyone willing to settle there, allowing people from other regions to move in and take up land. Another that was more isolated and surrounded by marginal farmland she'd decided to abandon completely, had moved the few remaining residents to other settlements, and had begun salvaging timber and stone from the buildings for use in maintaining structures elsewhere. The 3rd abandoned village, a place called Thornbury, she'd left in a kind of limbo, neither actively maintaining it nor completely abandoning it, simply allowing it to stand empty while she decided what its long-term fate should be. And it was Thornbury that fascinated Eleanor most, because it was there that she could see most clearly how quickly nature reclaimed land when human management ceased. Thornbury had been abandoned in early 1349, when the last surviving residents had left for larger settlements where they could find community and support. The village had been empty for nearly 3 years now, and the transformation was already striking. The thatched roofs that hadn't been maintained were sagging and sprouting vegetation, grasses and even small shrubs growing in the thatch. The gardens that had surrounded each house were completely overgrown. The careful plantings of vegetables and herbs disappeared under waves of weeds and brambles. The common fields that had once been plowed in neat strips were covered in tall grass and colonizing shrubs, making it impossible to even see where the field boundaries had been. Most striking to Eleanor was the speed of the colonization, how quickly the plants moved in when human activity ceased. It wasn't that nature was actively aggressive, wasn't that there was some force consciously reclaiming the land. It was simply that the suppression of natural processes that agriculture required was constant work, and when that work stopped, the suppression stopped, and the natural succession toward woodland began immediately. Eleanor had studied this process in Thornbury with the attention she might have given to managing a productive estate. She'd walked through the abandoned village regularly, noting the changes, observing which plants colonized first and which followed, understanding the ecological succession that was transforming the settlement from human space to wild space. She'd noticed that the first colonizers were annual plants, weeds, and grasses that produced enormous numbers of seeds and that could establish quickly in disturbed soil. These annuals had covered the gardens and the trampled areas around buildings within a single growing season after abandonment, creating a dense herbaceous cover where vegetables and human activity had previously kept the ground relatively clear. Then came the brambles, blackberries, and other thorny shrubs that thrived in open conditions, and that formed impenetrable tangles if left unchecked. These were colonizing the edges of buildings and the margins of fields, creating barriers that would make it difficult for anyone to move through the village or to resume cultivation of the fields without extensive clearing work. And already, after just 3 years, tree saplings were appearing, birch and hawthorn and oak, scattered through the brambles and the tall grass, small now but growing, establishing the woody vegetation that would eventually dominate if the succession continued. In another 5 years, the saplings would be young trees. In another 10, they'd be forming canopy. In another 20, Thornbury would look more like woodland with scattered ruins than like a village with some overgrown areas. This timeline fascinated and troubled Eleanor. It meant that abandonment wasn't easily reversible, that if she wanted to resettle Thornbury or similar villages, she needed to do it relatively soon, within the next few years, before the succession to woodland progressed to the point where clearing and re-establishing cultivation would require as much work as the original clearance had required centuries ago when the land was first brought under the plow. But she didn't have the labor to resettle the villages, didn't have the tenants willing to take up land that was already becoming overgrown and difficult, didn't have the resources to offer incentives attractive enough to overcome people's reluctance to settle in isolated locations when they could find opportunities in towns or on better positioned estates. So the succession continued, the villages remained abandoned, the fields reverted to scrub and woodland, and Eleanor watched the transformation with a mixture of resignation and scientific fascination. She began keeping notes on what she observed, documenting the ecological changes in the abandoned villages and fields. This wasn't something she'd been trained to do as the daughter and then wife of minor nobility. Her education had focused on household management and religious instruction, not on natural history or systematic observation. But the magnitude of what was happening, the scale of landscape transformation she was witnessing, seemed important enough to document, seemed like it should be recorded, even if she didn't know what use the records might have. She wrote descriptions of the plant succession, noting which species appeared first and which followed, trying to understand the patterns. She drew maps showing which fields remained in cultivation and which had been abandoned, updating them annually as more land went out of production. She recorded the condition of buildings in the abandoned villages, noting which were collapsing and how quickly, and she wrote about the animals, the wildlife that was responding to the landscape changes. The abandoned villages and reverting fields were becoming habitat for species that had been rare or absent when the land was intensively managed. Eleanor noticed increasing numbers of deer, freed from hunting pressure, and able to browse on the new growth in the abandoned fields. She saw more foxes and badgers, predators that benefited from the increased cover and the abundance of small mammals that colonized the overgrown areas. Birds were changing too. The species that preferred open farmland, the skylarks and lapwings that had nested in the cultivated fields, were declining as their habitat was lost. But woodland species were increasing, following the trees as they colonized the abandoned land. Eleanor heard woodpeckers drumming in the scattered trees that were growing in the former fields, saw tawny owls hunting along the margins of the reverting woodland, noticed more songbirds that preferred shrubby habitat. The wildlife changes were less immediately visible than the vegetation changes, but they were equally significant in Eleanor's view. The landscape wasn't just changing in appearance, wasn't just becoming more vegetated. It was becoming ecologically different, was developing different habitat structure, was supporting different communities of plants and animals, was transforming from a managed agricultural ecosystem into something that resembled the wildwood that had existed before human clearance. Eleanor's daughter, Margaret, was less interested in the ecological changes than in the practical implications. "If the land is reverting to forest," Margaret asked one day as they walked through the edges of one of the abandoned villages, "can we at least use it for timber? Can we manage it as woodland rather than farmland?" It was a sensible question, the kind of practical approach to changed circumstances that Eleanor was trying to teach Margaret. And indeed, woodland could be valuable timber for construction and fuel, pannage for pigs, hunting grounds for deer. If the abandoned farmland was going to become woodland regardless of what Eleanor did, why not try to manage that woodland productively, rather than simply watching it develop without human intervention? Eleanor had been thinking about this, had considered whether she should actively manage the succession, planting valuable timber species or coppicing the colonizing trees to create managed woodland that could provide long-term income. But she'd concluded that this was beyond her current capacity, required labor and expertise she didn't have, would mean investing in very long-term returns when she was struggling to maintain even short-term production. "Perhaps eventually," Eleanor told Margaret, "when if we have more resources, more labor. But right now we need to focus on maintaining what we can maintain, on keeping the remaining farmland productive. We can't take on managing new woodlands when we're barely managing to keep our existing holdings functional." This was the painful reality of the post-plague world that Eleanor was learning to navigate. Before the catastrophe, the Ashford estates had been complex operations involving farmland, woodland, pasture, buildings, infrastructure, all carefully managed, all maintained in good condition, all contributing to the family's income and status. Now, Eleanor was forced to prioritize ruthlessly, to maintain only what was absolutely essential, to let go of anything that wasn't immediately productive or that required too much labor or investment. She thought about the people who'd lived in those villages, the families who'd farmed those fields, the communities that had sustained themselves for generations on the land that was now reverting to forest. They were mostly dead or scattered, had been destroyed by the plague, or had migrated to places that offered better opportunities. The villages had been their homes, the fields had been their livelihood. The landscape had been shaped by their labor and their needs. Now their homes were collapsing, their fields were disappearing. The landscape was erasing the evidence of their existence. This felt like a particular tragedy to Eleanor, a loss that went beyond the immediate deaths and economic disruption. It was the loss of cultural memory, the erasure of community history, the obliteration of the accumulated knowledge and effort that generations of people had invested in this landscape. When the villages were completely ruined and the fields were completely forested, when there was no visible evidence that this had ever been intensively managed agricultural land, what would remain of all those lives, all that labor, all that local knowledge of this specific place? Eleanor's documentation was an attempt to preserve something, to create a record that would outlast the physical evidence, that would tell future generations that this landscape had once been different, had once been the home and workplace of hundreds of people who lived and died and shaped this place according to their needs and abilities. She didn't know if anyone would ever read her notes, didn't know if her documentation would survive any better than the buildings and field systems she was describing. But creating the record felt important, felt like a responsibility, felt like the least she could do to honor the people and the way of life that were being lost. As Eleanor aged through her 50s and into her 60s, she continued managing the reduced Ashford estates, adapting to the new agricultural reality where less land was cultivated, but where the land that remained in production was often more productive because it was the best land and because it received more attention with less area to manage. The estates remained profitable, though never as profitable as they'd been before the plague. Eleanor maintained her position, kept the family solvent, ensured that Margaret would inherit something valuable, even if it was diminished from what Eleanor herself had inherited. And she continued her observations of the landscape transformation, continued documenting the fields returning to forest, the abandoned villages disappearing beneath vegetation, the wildlife responding to the habitat changes. The work became something between scientific study and memorial practice, between ecological observation and historical documentation, between attempting to understand natural processes and attempting to preserve human memory. By the 1370s, when Eleanor was in her 60s, the transformation was advanced. The abandoned villages were mostly gone, reduced to barely visible ruins, overgrown with trees and shrubs. The fields that had been abandoned in the late 1340s and early 1350s were now genuine woodland, young forest, but forest nonetheless, with canopy cover and woodland structure and ecological communities that were distinctly different from the grasslands and agricultural systems that had occupied the same space 2 decades earlier. The speed of the transformation had surprised Eleanor, even though she'd been watching it unfold year by year. 25 years from cultivated field to mature woodland. It was an eye blink in ecological time, barely a moment in the life of a forest, but it was most of Eleanor's adult life. It was the entire period since the plague. It was within the memory and experience of anyone who'd survived the catastrophe. This meant that the transformation was documented not just in Eleanor's notes, but in living memory, in the stories that survivors told about how the landscape had changed, in the collective knowledge of a generation that had witnessed the retreat of agriculture and the return of the forest. Eleanor talked with other landowners, with the surviving farmers, with people who'd spent their entire lives in the region, gathering their observations and their stories, and incorporating them into her documentation. One old farmer, a man named John, who was in his 70s, and who'd farmed the same land for more than 50 years, told Eleanor, "I remember when all this was open fields, when you could stand at the manor house and see for miles, when the whole valley was striped with cultivation, and there wasn't a tree except in the managed woodlots. Now look at it. Half returned to forest, the rest reverting. In my lifetime, the landscape has changed more than it did in the previous 1,000 years. We made it open, we kept it open, and we've lost the ability to maintain what we created. The forest was always waiting, always ready to return. We held it back for centuries, but our hold wasn't as strong as we thought. One catastrophe, and it all starts reverting. This perspective that the agricultural landscape had been a temporary human imposition on a land that naturally wanted to be. Forest became central to how Eleanor understood what she was witnessing. The farmland hadn't been natural in the sense of being what the landscape would be without human intervention. It had been a cultural creation, maintained through constant effort, existing only because each generation chose to continue the work of keeping the forest back, keeping the fields open, maintaining the infrastructure that intensive agriculture required. When the plague had killed a third or more of the population, when labor became scarce and the survivors had other opportunities, the choice to maintain marginal farmland became less obvious, less necessary. The forest wasn't actively attacking the farmland, it was simply filling the spaces that human activity no longer defended, simply continuing the ecological succession that was the land's trajectory when human management ceased. Eleanor thought about this in terms of stability and equilibrium. The agricultural landscape had been stable in the sense that it had persisted for centuries, had reproduced itself generation after generation through continued human labor and management. But it hadn't been stable in an ecological sense, hadn't been a self-maintaining system, had required constant inputs of energy and effort to prevent succession toward woodland. The woodland that was now returning was more stable ecologically, more self-maintaining, less dependent on continued human intervention to persist. Once trees were established, once canopy formed, the woodland would reproduce itself without human help, would maintain its structure and composition through natural processes, would be stable in ways that agricultural land could never be. This suggested something both troubling and oddly reassuring. Troubling because it meant that the agricultural landscape was always vulnerable, always dependent on continued human choice and effort, always potentially reversible if circumstances changed. But reassuring because it meant that the land itself had resilience, had the capacity to recover from intensive human use, could regenerate ecological complexity and structure when given the opportunity. Eleanor had seen destructive landscapes, had visited areas where intensive agriculture had degraded soil and created erosion, and left land that was barely productive even with heavy labor inputs. But what she was witnessing on the Ashford estates was different, not degradation, but recovery. Not land being destroyed, but land being allowed to restore itself. Not ecological poverty, but ecological succession toward greater complexity and diversity. This distinction mattered to Eleanor as she thought about the long-term fate of the abandoned land. Yes, it was a loss from the perspective of agricultural production and human utility. But it wasn't a loss from an ecological perspective, wasn't land being destroyed or wasted, was actually land recovering, developing, becoming more complex and more biodiverse than it had been as farmland. When Eleanor died in 1381, at the age of 73, she left behind the substantially reduced Ashford estates, which her daughter Margaret inherited and continued to manage. She also left behind her documentation several volumes of notes and maps and observations about the landscape. Transformation, about fields returning to forest, about the abandoned villages and their fate, about the ecological succession she'd witnessed over more than 30 years. Margaret preserved these documents even though she didn't continue the systematic observation that her mother had practiced. The notes were kept with the estate records, treated as part of the family archive, occasionally consulted, but mostly just maintained as historical documents that recorded a particular period in the region's history. Centuries later, when historians and ecologists became interested in understanding how European landscapes had changed over time, when scholars were trying to document the long-term impacts of the Black Death on settlement patterns and land use, Eleanor's notes were discovered in an archive and recognized as an extraordinary resource, a detailed, systematic account of landscape transformation written by someone who'd witnessed and documented the process as it happened. The notes provided insights that no other source could match. Church records and tax documents could show which villages were abandoned and when, but they couldn't describe how quickly the buildings collapsed or which plants colonized the fields first. Economic records could show declining cultivation and changing land values, but they couldn't explain the ecological processes that drove the transformation from farmland to woodland. Chronicles and letters might mention the landscape changes in passing, but none had the systematic attention and long-term observation that Eleanor's notes provided. Scholars wrote papers about Eleanor's documentation, using her observations to understand succession dynamics, to estimate colonization rates for different plant species, to model the long-term landscape changes that followed major population decline. Ecologists interested in rewilding and natural regeneration used her notes as evidence for how quickly ecosystems could recover when intensive human management ceased. Historians interested in the social and economic impacts of the plague used her descriptions of abandoned villages and contracting cultivation to understand how catastrophic mortality affected settlement patterns and agricultural systems. But beyond the scholarly interest, Eleanor's notes did what she'd intended them to do. They preserved memory of the landscape that had existed, of the people who'd shaped it, of the transformation that had occurred. Reading her descriptions of the abandoned villages, future generations could understand that these had been real communities, that real people had lived and worked there, that the woodland that now covered the sites had once been intensively managed farmland, supporting hundreds of lives. The fields had returned to forest. The villages had disappeared. The agricultural landscape that Eleanor had known in her youth had been replaced by woodland that showed few traces of its previous use. But through her documentation, through the careful record she'd kept of the transformation, something of that earlier landscape and the people who'd created it was preserved, was passed forward, was made available to anyone who wanted to understand how landscapes changed, how human and natural processes interacted, how catastrophe could trigger ecological transformation that reshaped regions in ways that persisted for centuries. The forest that returned after the plague wasn't the same as the primeval wildwood that had existed before human clearance. It grew on soils that had been modified by centuries of cultivation. It colonized landscapes that still showed the marks of previous human activity in their topography and drainage patterns. It developed in the context of continued human presence and management on adjacent lands. But it was forest, nonetheless, was woodland with canopy and understory, and the complex ecological structure that characterized mature temperate forests was habitat for woodland species and ecosystem processes that were fundamentally different from what agricultural land supported. And standing in that forest, centuries after Eleanor's death, in the woodland that had once been the field she'd watched transform, you could see evidence of what had been if you knew how to look. Subtle ridges in the ground that marked old field boundaries. Changes in tree size and composition that reflected different colonization times. Scattered stones that had been cleared from fields and piled in corners. Low mounds covered in vegetation that marked the sites of abandoned buildings. The landscape remembered, in its own way, not consciously, not in human terms, but physically, structurally, in the traces that previous uses had left in soils and vegetation and topography. The fields had returned to forest, but they'd returned imperfectly, carrying evidence of their agricultural past in subtle patterns that would persist for centuries, for millennia, that would remain as long as the forest itself persisted. This was what Eleanor had understood as she documented the transformation, that landscapes held memory, that human uses left marks that outlasted the uses themselves, that even when nature reclaimed land and forest, replaced fields, something of what had been remained, was preserved in forms that could be read by anyone willing to look carefully, to attend to the details, to understand that the present landscape was always a palimpsest, always layered with the traces of previous landscapes, always carrying within its current form the evidence of its history. The fields had returned to forest. Nature had reclaimed the land, but the reclamation wasn't erasure, wasn't a complete obliteration of human history, was rather a transformation that preserved even as it changed, that maintained memory even as it created something new, that demonstrated that nature and culture, wild and managed, human and non-human, were always intertwined, always influencing each other, always creating landscapes that reflected both natural processes and human choices, both ecological succession and historical contingency. Eleanor's life's work, her decades of observation and documentation, her systematic recording of fields returning to forest, had captured this complexity, had shown how landscapes transformed, how human absence created space for natural regeneration, how catastrophe could trigger ecological changes that reshaped regions, how the interaction between human and natural processes created the ever-changing landscapes that each generation inherited and modified and passed forward to the next, always different, always bearing the marks of what had come before, always in transition toward something new.